So maybe I'll just say roughly what we'll be doing this evening. So I'm going to talk probably for about 30-35 minutes, hopefully not longer than that. And then see if there are any questions, maybe just questions or comments for a few minutes. And then we're going to do a short reflection / meditation coming out of one of the themes that I'm going to talk about. So we'll end up having tea about 8:30. Distracted. And then we'll meditate about 5 to 9 for half an hour or so, and end with the last bandhana, the verses that protect the truth. So I'm going to give some parts of a talk that I was asked to give in Oxford about 3 years ago, the Oxford Buddhist group there. And I was asked to talk about how the Buddha taught. So that's the sort of overall theme. But there is quite a... I think coming out of the Buddha teaching, there's quite a sense of gratitude. So that's partly what we'll do a little bit later on. But I want to put it just in the context of world events, I think, at the moment. We are all here because of the Buddha teaching. We all have access to a lot of resources that allow us to empathize with what's happening in the Ukraine, and to empathize and if you like, feel metta not just towards the Ukrainians, but towards Russians as well, towards all suffering people and all people in conflict, suffering, tension. So, in a way, we sit with access to some of those qualities, to those resources that facilitate a lack of sort of warring within us. So they facilitate a sort of peaceful response, an open-hearted response, and a response of clarity as well. So, talking within that context. So when I heard this title from the Praniketu in the Oxford group a few years ago, I thought, I don't just want to talk about how the Buddha taught. It started me thinking about all sorts of, or where the Buddha taught, what he taught, and also how he learned, if you like. The Buddha not only as teacher but as student. I got quite interested in all that area. So tonight we'll mainly look at how the Buddha taught and how he learned, just with a little nod to the where and the what. But I hope along the way to introduce or reintroduce you to some of the Buddha's teachings, some of his friends and disciples, as well as moments from his life. So I was reminded of a visit to Bodh Gaya. It took about 3 years ago, I think around the time that I first gave this talk. So the scene of the Buddha's enlightenment, where the Buddha first taught as an enlightened one. And it's very, very palpable, that sense of the Buddha teaching around the Bodhi tree, or being in Bodh Gaya, even with all its pollution and noise and heat and dust. Very significant to be there. There's really that sense of lineage and discipleship, being a direct disciple of the Buddha, when you're, for me anyway, in Bodh Gaya. And there was a particularly auspicious occasion. I think actually it was an occasion where two Indian, a man and a young woman, were joining the order. So they had part of their ordination ceremony in the Mahabodhi temple, or in the grounds of the temple. And it was a night where there was, I get this right, there was a super blue full blood moon. It was all of those things. It was a blue moon, it was a super moon, it was a blood moon, and it was obviously a full moon. So it just felt there was all this sort of mythic significance, adding, the natural world was bringing, if you like, that was adding to the significance of being in the place where the Buddha first taught, being there with the order and seeing people enter the order. It was very magical.
Not where he first taught.
Sorry?
Not where he first taught, stage of respect, where he's enlightened.
Where he first taught as an enlightened being. Okay, maybe Vajradevi disagrees. Okay. We'll pass over that for now. You can tell me later. Okay. So there's actually some specific teachings that are given around the Mahabodhi temple. So one of them is given at the Ajapali Nigrodha, which is the goat herd's banyan tree. So there's this particular point where there's a type of pillar, and this is where the Buddha gave, he came into contact with someone, and he gave what became his teaching on karma, the teaching of worth, not birth, which is still I find it incredibly moving, that it's still very, very, unfortunately, very relevant today. But that's, it was one of his earliest teachings as an enlightened being, was what makes a true Brahmin, and it's not one's birth, it's one's qualities, one's spiritual qualities, one's ethical qualities, one's positive ethical response to the world. So how the Buddha taught, how he learned, that's what we're going to do first. So the Buddha was a student. I'm afraid I'm going to keep calling him the Buddha. I get mixed up. I try and call him Gautama before he was a Buddha, and I forget. So Gautama, the Buddha, was a student before he was a teacher. So what sort of a student was he? And I think we can learn from asking this question. We have a lot within our sort of modern repertoire, if you like, of different learning styles or learning skills and different ways that we learn. And I think I found it quite instructive looking back on, if you like, how the Buddha learned. One learning, if you like, what do you call it? It's not quite a style, but a sort of, it's a few different ways of dividing up ways that you learn. I learnt in Cambridge actually, and it's something called CAPS. So it stands for, the C is for concepts, the A is for attitudes, the P is for practices, and the S is for symbols and stories. So I find it fits really, really well, looking at different approaches to the Dharma through that particular lens. It's just one way of articulating a learning approach, but I find I can identify sort of strengths and weaknesses and preferences, and I think most importantly how I respond, in what ways I respond to the Dharma. Is it through stories? Is it through images? One thing that the Buddha didn't do much of, but as in a different part of the tradition, is through poems and song. And actually that happens more within the Tibetan tradition, quite a lot of songs, but Milarepa was the one with the 100,000 songs that we have access to today. So this is against the Buddha as a... I'll come back to that. Okay, so three ways that the Buddha learned. So one of them was through trying things out, by taking an approach as far as he could, and letting it go if it couldn't take him any further. And he did this quite a bit with different teachers. His teachers Alara Kalama and Udaka Ramaputta. So they would have been quite happy for him to sort of stay with him and just sort of take his seat as a teacher alongside them. But he recognised that they'd taken him as far as he could go with them, and so he left so that he could carry on his search. So it wasn't in his nature to think, well, actually this is it. This is as far as I can go. I'll just sort of rest here or stop here. So there wasn't any sense of complacency, but an incredible resolve around his burning question. You know, what is the purpose of a human life when dukkha is there? How to understand and bring to an end dukkha. So he could have had fame at that point. He could have, had a sort of rested on his laurels, been very well known. But yeah, he didn't do that. And at a certain point he tried, for a long period of time, apparently tried these ascetic practices, which were very common in India. The lying on the beds of nails and the doing all sorts of painful things, I think mostly painful things, with bits of one's anatomy. Let's leave it at that. But he realised that it wasn't the way to enlightenment. Actually, just testing the body, putting the body under a lot of stress and strain and discomfort was not the way to free the mind. And he came to that realisation. And so he stopped. He just stopped it, and he lost the respect of his peers at that point, who thought he'd gone soft. Part of these ascetic practices was just eating very, very little. So another way of sort of putting a lot of strain on the body. And the Buddha started eating a little bit more. So we don't know if the Buddha minded, if his feelings were a bit hurt that his friends turned away from him, and he seemed to lose their respect. But even if it did hurt his feelings, he carried on. He wasn't sort of in it to be popular or to, again, it's that integrity, just not being affected by the worldly winds. So that's the first thing. He learned by trying things out. A second thing, and these are all a bit linked, he learned through his own direct experience. Not theoretical experience, not metaphysical, but testing things out for himself. Learning to watch his own mind, making a laboratory of his mind so that he could look at how the mind works from within. So it's a big part of what he was doing, using his own experience. And again, this third thing is connected, but he followed his own path, his own inner direction. And in Bhante's terms, he was a true individual, had all these qualities of the individual. but he was also receptive to his teachers. So one of the Buddha's own teachings is that of the Kalama Sutta. The Buddha's, where he teaches the importance of relying on one's own experience and of relying on the words of the wise, not just one or the other. And we need to know what the words of the wise are. So we do need to know what the teachings of the Buddha are to some degree, to understand, perhaps through study, perhaps through stories, perhaps through practices, but we do need to understand what the teachings are. If we just rely on our experience, well, the mind is conditioned and has its own biases. So it makes it quite sort of slippery. So we'll end up not seeing that clearly if we simply rely on our own experience. But if we balance it up, we won't get far with either side actually, because if we are go too far without relating the teachings to our own experience, I think we'll end up with our understanding or our learning being quite theoretical. And I think what Bhante called an armchair Buddhist. I think we'd be in danger of being an armchair Buddhist. So we need both. Okay, so that's going to move on to how the Buddha taught. We don't actually know for sure what the Buddha taught and how the Buddha taught. There's a lot that was written down much, much later. And we have this phrase, Buddha Vajana, the words of the Buddha. I think it's a very strong phrase. We don't know. A lot was repeated. There was the very strong oral tradition. So things were sort of repeated and passed through. And so that's what we have. And we sort of have to take it on trust, and that trust sort of, in a way, referenced against our own experience to does this teaching work? Does it conduce to freedom? Does it conduce to freedom from suffering? Just a word for the oral tradition. When I first came along to True Randa, there was quite a lot of learning things off by heart. And actually I think it's a really lovely way to engage with a teaching and understand it if, I think a lot of us just learn the Heart Sutra off by heart in quite early on. And other friends I've met over the years, they might take a particular teaching and just learn it. Actually, there's someone in the order who's learned the whole of the Dhammapada off by heart. And then she learnt it, and then she didn't practice it for a while. I think for a number of years she remembered it, and then recently she's gone back to learning it again because she said it's part of it sort of slipped through. But it means you've got those teachings in your memory. You can access them when you're alone or when you're on a train journey without access to a book or something. You can just turn over Dharma teachings in your mind. It's something I find really lovely about that. So I think that the Buddha instinctively knew that we learn in different ways, and different ways of learning suit different people. And I think this shows in the range of ways that he taught. So I want to just go through quite briefly just a few of those ways and give you examples. So analogy, metaphor analogy. So this came out in the Four Noble Truths, the teaching of the Four Noble Truths, where the Buddha, it's one of the times when the Buddha uses a medical analogy. He often uses an analogy where he's talking about himself as a physician, But in the Four Noble Truths, he's the first noble truth of suffering. You've got the diagnosis, the doctor's diagnosis. The second one, the cause of the sickness, that's craving. And then you've got the prognosis. Is there a cure? Actually, there is a cure. And then the fourth noble truth, you've got the cure, you've got the Noble Eightfold Path. So it's really, and I think he uses that a lot in different, that sort of analogy. So he often uses ordinary people's lives as examples, or sometimes animals, just because people were often living rural lives. Their lives were surrounded by animals, their livelihoods, and the source of their food. Often, there's animals around them. So one example of this is when he talks about the relationship between mindfulness and wisdom. And he says that mindfulness is like the neck of an elephant, and wisdom, panya, is like the head of the elephant. So the neck supports the head. Mindfulness, when there's mindfulness, it supports wisdom coming into being. It's a lovely little analogy. I use it a lot in my own teaching. So another analogy he uses that many of you may have come across is that of Sona. Sona, there's actually a whole story about Sona which I'd forgotten, which I haven't got time to go into, but it runs along the lines of that Sona was wondering why he hadn't got further along the path. His resolve was very, very strong, and because he was getting a bit disheartened and thinking maybe he'd go back to his family, since he'd been a monk, his family had got quite wealthy, and he thought, if I go back, I could have quite a good life now, quite an easy life. And the Buddha uses his sort of mental powers, and he picks up on what Sona's thinking about. And he uses, he comes and he sees that Sona has a lot of resolve, but he's been doing walking meditation until his feet are bleeding. His resolve is so strong, it's not balanced. And so he uses this analogy of the veena, which is a ancient Indian musical instrument, something like a lute or a lyre. And he says, what happens when you play your instrument? Because Sona is plays the lute. What happens if the strings are too tight? Or what happens if the strings are too sort of loose? And Sona says, well, it won't play. It either sounds horrible when they're tight, or it sounds really horrible in a different way when they're loose. And so the Buddha gives him this teaching of balanced effort, and the story has a happy ending because Sona soon balances his resolve and becomes an arahant and gives up his thoughts of going back to his wealthy family and living the life. Lives the noble life instead. So that's a few examples of the Buddha using metaphor or analogy. I think one of the most moving examples, which I'm sure you'll all be familiar with, is, in this case, what he's doing, he's giving someone a task. He's getting someone to do something. And the example I was thinking of was of Kisa Gotami, the young woman who suffered incredible loss in her life. And I think she might have lost her husband, but she definitely, she did. She lost her husband. Vajradevi is nodding. But she lost her child. She lost her young son, died as an infant, and she carried him around. And she went to the Buddha saying, please bring him back to life. Please, she was almost mad with grief. And so the Buddha knew that he couldn't reason with her. So he gave her this task. He said, go and knock on the door of any household and ask for a mustard seed. But when you get this mustard seed, it must be from the household where nobody has died. And through doing what the Buddha suggested, Kisa Gotami met all these people, makes me shiver, gives all, on their doorstep who are very happy to comply, just really can see her suffering and are willing to give her this tiny, tiny mustard seed. And then when it comes to the second part, when she says, but, well, has anyone died in this dwelling? And they say, oh yes, my father died a year ago, my sister died. You know, it just, every household there's somebody. And just, it's a really beautiful and moving way, I think, of bringing Kisa Gotami to a point where she sees and she understands that death can't be escaped, and that it is a natural part of life, and comes to a place of acceptance and is able to put her baby down. So lovely, it's a task, but it's also a story. It's the Buddha teaching. Well, we use it as a story, if you like, but his way of using it was very personal to her, and getting through this task. So another way, I wasn't quite sure, I've called this the sort of supernatural or imagination, I guess. But this is to do with the Buddha's, one of the Buddha's cousin, Nanda, and who was also thinking of giving up being a monk. I think it was probably quite common. It was probably, quite tough. They didn't have much in the way of, it was a very simple life. And Nanda was thinking of giving it up because he was in love. He'd left a young woman behind, and he missed her. He missed her, and the life perhaps was a bit austere with all these blokes. And so the Buddha, again, probably you're very familiar with this, the Buddha shows him a vision of dove-footed nymphs who are far more lovely than the young woman he's left behind. Of course, what the Buddha is pointing to through this image, if you like, is the beauties of spiritual freedom, the beauty of a completely open heart, of a completely free mind. And he's pointing to, the beauty and happiness of non-sensual spiritual pleasure and delight. So another way the Buddha taught was he taught through dialogue and reasoning. So he taught through asking questions of someone, not just sort of telling them things or telling them what to do, but through questions. So here I was thinking one of my favourite stories in the canon is King Bimbisara. The Buddha and King Bimbisara sitting in a little grove, a mango grove near a river, I think it's described. And I think it's Bimbisara starts sort of musing about who is happier, or maybe it's somebody, actually I think it's somebody with them who's saying, Bimbisara must be happier because he's a king. He must be happier than the Buddha. He's a king, he's got all this stuff. He's got rich food, he's got palaces, he's got dancing girls, he's got elephants, he's got harems, he's got all this stuff. And the Buddha's got next to nothing. He's got the four requisites. So he's got his robe, his bowl, he's got he's got access to medicine in the form of cow's urine. And he's got something else which I can't quite remember. probably Vajradevi knows. Something to shave his head and his feet. Thank you. So the Buddha he doesn't sort of debate, he just asks Bimbisara questions and questions around, could Bimbisara sit, in this grove or on the bank of the river for a certain length of time, not doing anything, not having any of his stuff, and still be happy. And first he asked him, could he sit there for an hour? And Bimbisara was quite confident. He said, yeah, I could do that. And then the Buddha says, could you do it for a day? Could you sit there for a day? And the Bimbisara says, not sure. But he eventually says yes. And then the Buddha says, well, could you sit here for a week? Completely content and happy without this. And Bimbisara, I think I tell this story in my book, so Bimbisara knows his limits. And he says, no, I couldn't. I wouldn't be happy doing that. I'd be pretty miserable, actually. But the Buddha actually is, what he's sort of demonstrating is his happiness isn't dependent on sense pleasures, isn't dependent upon anything. He actually has within him this inner happiness, again, of a free mind. I feel like the Buddha has the happiness of being free from desires, freedom from desires. So the last way, and I think probably the Buddha's one of his favourite ways, and I think it can be one of our favourite ways, is the chalk and talk method. So frequently he would be asked to give a discourse. He'd be surrounded by bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, sometimes lay men and lay women, in a forest or in a clearing, in a park. Someone had given him, and he would respond to a question. Maybe somebody would just ask him a question, and he would take it from there. He would extemporize. Another variation of the chalk and talk would be when the Buddha had something he wanted to say. And so he would call them together. He would call the disciples together. And this is what he did, apparently, when he gave the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha's primary teaching on mindfulness. He wanted to lay out this teaching, and he chose a particular group of people who were materially resourced. They were quite comfortable, and apparently they were just quite intelligent and ready. They were ready for the teaching. So within that chalk and talk, sometimes he would lay out the benefits. I almost called this, it's not a hard sell, I couldn't quite think of the right phrase for it, but he would say in the Satipatthana Sutta, he says exactly what it's for. This is the direct path for the surmounting of sorrow, lamentation and grief. So he lays out what the benefits of the teaching, its importance, and then at the end he lays out the reward. He gives this prediction at the end of the Satipatthana Sutta, and he says if you practice this, he starts off at 7 years. He has this method: it's 7 years. One of 2 fruits in spiritual practice are to be attained. And they're different stages of enlightenment. I can't remember the exact wording, but basically they're sort of high spiritual attainments. But then he goes down from 7 years, and he goes down gradually. I'm going to save us the time, but he goes down, and he ends up at 7 days. If for 7 days you really practiced what's in this teaching, 1 of 2 fruits can be expected, but a very high spiritual attainment. So he's in a way spelling out the rewards to be gained. So he's motivating his students in a very nice way. And one last thing about that sutta, I think the Buddha is teaching in the way that, one of the ways that he learned in that sutta, because the Satipatthana Sutta is all about direct experience. We learn how to watch the mind. We learn what to watch and how to watch it. So I really like that. I like that actually when we're practicing that sutta, we're practicing in a way that the Buddha learned for himself. So we have his legacy. We have many teachings, and it's down to us how we use them 2,500 years later. And before Gautama became the Buddha, the Dharma had died out. Sometimes I think about this, what if there was no path? To be led to. The path hasn't died out in those 2,500 years. But it's quite a thought, I find, to think what if it had, what if it wasn't accessible, wasn't available? And sometimes it can seem so random what actually led me to the path. I can see that there was a certain amount of searching and excitement in me, a looking for meaning that manifested itself in things that you wouldn't necessarily think would lead to the spiritual life. I did a lot of travelling and a lot of hitchhiking and quite a lot of skydiving. Those seemed to be my main ways that I sort of was expressing some sort of wish to go deeper, find a deeper way to live. And I was really sort of lucky, I think, that it brought me in contact with the Dharma. That sort of restlessness, that sort of searching going on. So I think it's worth reflecting, and I think maybe this will happen in the groups next week, reflecting on both what difference the Dharma's made to your life. Whether you've been practicing a short time or a long time, what difference has it made? What do you have a sense of what your life might have been like without coming across the Dharma in some sort of way? So I don't know. I feel it's maybe not a very, I don't know if it's a very popular word, but I sort of feel like in some ways it's all of our responsibility to practice as well as we can to keep the teachings alive, to keep, and I think the motivation is there. If I think about what my life might have been like without coming across the Dharma, then that motivation is there to keep practicing and to keep, in a way, not necessarily teaching. I mean, that is some of the way, but somehow exemplifying the Dharma and being open to the people I meet, where a sense an opening to the Dharma. In fact, just a few days ago, one of my nieces expressed an interest in meditation, and I just immediately said, I'll send you a book. I'll send you a book and I'll send you some links. And I sent her some links to our website here, so that she's got that access. So I think that's really all I want to say for now.